The Orbea Occam is a 150 front and rear travel, 29-inch all-around trail mountain bike. I've been riding this Orbea Occam for quite a few months now, but recently I got to set it up with my own personal slew of parts. This made the bike feel a lot better for the kind of riding that I like to do most. We've been dealing with quite the winter here in the Pacific Northwest, so I was lucky enough to travel with the bike down to the desert. This video is broken up into a few different parts. You can scroll through the various chapters if you just want to watch riding and travel stuff, or if you want to learn about the actual bike, which is worth it because it's pretty darn cool. Without further ado, let's get in the shop and start working on the Orbea Occam. This right here is the Orbea Occam LT. You guys saw it a couple months ago on the channel. It's been waiting for some parts, but good news, today those parts have arrived. Before we get into this video, I want to give a huge thank you to my sponsor, Jensen USA. Jensen is a dealer for Orbea bikes here in the United States of America. I've got a link to the Orbea Occam in the description down below. It takes you over to Jensen. You can learn all about the geometry, the various price points and spec options available. You can see what's in stock. Anything you purchase from Jensen from that link down below, that'll also help support me with making these videos come to all of you. Beyond Jensen, I'm also supported by Industry 9 and P&W components. Most recently, the Orbea you have seen on my channel is called the Rise. The biggest difference between the Rise and the Occam is that on the Rise, you charge lithium-ion battery. On the Occam, you use your lungs and your legs and you pedal hard. They're both super fun bikes, but one's an e-bike and one's a traditional bicycle. When I review bikes, I like to really understand them, and I like to eliminate these variables of the other parts on here that they may be good parts, maybe not so good. But I have some very good stuff that I've been using for years here, and I'm now sponsored by these brands, which is really cool. Right now we're talking about bikes, and we talk about bikes, what we're really talking about are the frames. First up, the cockpit. I'm really excited to put my P&W components, handlebar, stem, grips, remote for the dropper seat post, and I've got a big old loam dropper post, 31/6 diameter. It's a 200 mil drop, and you can adjust this thing between the 200 and I think 170 or 150 or so. So I can get a lot more drop with this post than I could with the stock seat post. After getting the P&W cockpit on here, I'm also gonna throw on some Industry 9 wheels. They use the carbon fiber WeAre1 composites rims, which I have on a bunch of my other bikes, and they are really, really good. Let's start wrenching. A lot of bikes come with these race face wheels OEM, and they're honestly pretty good. One of my favorite things about Industry 9 wheels is they include a couple of spare spokes. Yes! Look at that. Gold with black, looks good. The front tire, I'm doing an Ask Guy. I really like these tires when I was testing them for Jensen USA, and I did a whole video review about them. Having worked at the competition from Axis for a long time, it was pretty interesting getting to know these tires much more intimately. They are pretty good. And are we gonna seat? Let's find out. Cool, that was pretty easy. So I have my choice between an aggressor and a dissector back tire, and the Occam came stock with a dissector. Pretty good choice. I think I'm gonna go with an aggressor. Aggressor's faster rolling, be better for the more trail-oriented nature of a bike like this. Cool. Boom, ooh. Green and gold, we got our G's happening. And I'll need some pedals. Ooh, Saints. P&W cockpit and front rotor. Let's do it. I'll cut my bars down to 760, have my P&W bars, and I'll throw my 50 mil stem on there. The race face cockpit that's on here works fine. I really like my P&W stuff. I'm used to it. I won't mind having my handlebars a touch higher either. Let's get to it. I gotta cut them down to 760. They're going on the Occam. Orange accents and all. Right into the trash can. It's looking pretty good. Looks way better, to be honest. This thing's sweet. Woo! Now this looks ready to rock. I hope I did not just jinx myself with that. The Occam is now running a 200 mil dropper seat post. We'll see if we have contact between the saddle and the rear tire. I did slide it all the way back because this is kind of a compact cockpit. I'm running the 50 mil stem, once again, a little bit longer. Stay nice and stretched out. 760 bars, they're a little higher than the stockers. I've got them rocked a little bit forwards, trying to get more space here. I've got a loam lever right here for the dropper post, super comfortable, and the bright orange grips. Can't go wrong. Got some tickets booked. Tomorrow we head to the desert. Next time we check in, we'll be somewhere warmer, drier, and sunnier. Let's go. My first ride on the upgraded Orbea Occam was at the Haas mountain bike trail system just outside of Mesa, Arizona. If you want to learn more about the Haas trail system, I did a whole video featuring the Haas Trail Alliance, which has created a ton of additional trail mileage since they began only a few short years ago. I'll link to that video down below in the description, and I'll also put a link to the top right corner of your screen. The riding in the desert is much different than the riding back home. Traction is much more available. Impacts are pretty harsh because it's hard to pile up desert soil into nice, soft backsides. As a result, the challenges a bike feels in the desert are very different than the challenges back home, which I think makes this video better, having two very different environments to compare and contrast the Orbea Occam. Y'all might have noticed that there are gratuitous wheelies throughout both the Haas video and, of course, this one here. Why? Well, the Occam is really easy to wheelie and manual on. The short chainstay, combined with the somewhat short front center, means it's really easy to get the front end up into the air. Also, that suspension design feels pretty similar to the Horselink bikes in that it's very predictable and very easy to do things when you're on just the rear wheel. The leverage ratio is not super progressive, but it's more progressive than the previous iteration Occam. I did do a full video looking at the 2020 Orbea Occam, and I will also link to that in the description down below. While you will see a ton of wheelies and manuals, not only do I normally ride like this on bikes I enjoy riding, but you're going to see probably a few less big giant hucks and jumps and such. Well, what the bike makes up for is slower speed tech moves like all the manuals. It kind of gives up a little bit the higher speed stuff, so if you're looking for more of a bike park sender, this probably wouldn't be the best choice. That's right, this is a bike review sponsored by a bike shop, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this bike is better in one place than another because I think honesty and transparency is very important.
Still so good though. There we go.
So I've been dealing with the rear tire hitting the saddle, and if the rear wheel is not on the ground, when that happens, or if it's not a lot of pressure, it can lock up the rear wheel, which gets kind of sketchy. I can fix this. So I got 200 mils drop right now. I'm gonna push this down a little bit, and I'm gonna shorten the amount of drop I have by 10 millimeters. I just want to be clear that this contact is a result of my using a bigger dropper post and not anything wrong with the Occam itself. Okay, so right now we're at 0. We'll do minus 10. Gonna make sure we're down enough that it'll catch. Tighten it back down. If you guys think 10 millimeters is gonna be enough to make a difference, leave me a comment down below. If you think it's not gonna be enough to make a difference, hit the red subscribe button. Smash it, like they say on the internet. Okay, and then step 2, right here it says flip. The bike has a built-in multi-tool hidden in one of the pivot shafts. It says FLP. I don't know what that means. So now I've got to slide the whole seat post up. It's just really hard to get into this multi-tool. So I'm gonna raise my saddle exactly 10 millimeters. You guys know how I make sure it's exactly 10 mils? I guess. Okay, then hopefully all of you left a comment will be right that this will fix the situation. The bike came stock with a 150 millimeter drop seat post, and the rest of my bikes have close to 200 mil drop. For me, with my riding style, having that extra room to get down on the bike makes a huge difference. When it does come to jumping, this bike is really easy to get into the air. Again, thanks to that short wheelbase, short front center, and short back end, it means as long as you preload pretty well, you can get a nice pop off just about anything. On slower speed trails, this is great. On higher speed, more bike parky trails, it can get a little hectic because if you really start to yank and pull for big gaps, you can start to outride what the bike's really intended for, which is fair. This is a trail bike. This is not an enduro or freeride bike, and it's not attempting to be one. Comparing the Occam to the Pivot Switchblade, the bikes feel very different on the trail. What I personally noticed more was the extra 10 mils travel for the 160 fork on the Switchblade, and the torsional stiffness of the Switchblade is much higher. The Switchblade is a bike that you can send a bit higher and deeper on the jumps. Let's wash off that sunscreen and go somewhere a little bit more lush. Today we wanted to contrast riding the Occam out in the desert with what we ride here. We found a couple of really interesting pieces of woodwork, including a skinny bridge. And I thought this bike worked pretty good on that. I mean, like, okay, it's a skinny bridge, yeah. But a longer, more aggressive bike will be quite a handful to get onto that bridge and control all the way across it. Hopping this thing around, it's so short, it's pretty easy to get off the ground, which is kind of a theme of this bike in general. The way the rear suspension works out, it's not like super glued to the ground. And then with the very short front end, you can pull it right on up and get over things. So we found multiple log hop opportunities today, which was great because I need the exercise, and the Occam is the bike of choice when it comes to that low speed, super technical, hoppy kind of mountain biking. We rode some really ridiculous skinnies, which were a hoot on this bike. Same tires and wheels I usually have, 2.5 Ascii, 2.4 Aggressor. There we go. Worked great on the really narrow stuff. If you are wondering how the Evil Offering compares to this bike, well, even though the Offering has a little bit less travel and is a similarly steep head tube angle, the Offering is quite a bit longer and it's much torsionally stiffer. In short, the Offering feels like a lot more bike. It feels more like an enduro bike, and it can handle more bike parky stuff than the Occam really would ever want to. So the trails here in Bellingham are steeper than most of the trails out in the Phoenix greater area, or even Sedona for that matter. Arizona's trails are great and they're fun, but they're very different than this. Our trails are a little bit, they're just tons of fresh, muddy dirt, and your average trail speed ends up being a little bit higher. There's less consequence, less rock. Traction's different. Our knobs are penetrating the soil, but then they are sliding anyhow. In Arizona, it's a whole different experience. When it came to cornering, our trails here, the corners on what we were riding today, are pretty tight. And that was the struggle on this bike. Yes, you can go into a stoppie and you can stoppie right through them, and it does stoppie great with that steep head angle, but I've been riding my Ripmo the last few days and my little Chromag Stylus, and both those bikes, you can just lean them over and crank them right through those kind of corners. The Occam is a little bit steeper head angle, and when you get it really leaned over, it's not quite as happy as the slacker bikes. Officially, the Occam has a 65.5 head tube angle. However, it feels quite a bit steeper on the trail, and I think a big part of that is how short the bike is. Remember, the whole wheelbase of this bike is sub 1200 millimeters. That's almost 40 millimeters shorter than my Ibis Ripmo V2. Yes, there are advantages to the steeper head angle, like that easy bunny hoppability, the easy control on the low speed skinnies. That's great. But those corners, oh man, I give up a little bit in those corners, and that's, every design choice ends up being a compromise of some sort. And I think Orbea did a really good job with this, but I do notice that. And like I said in the intro, that's fixable. The frame is actually not compatible with an angle set. However, I have ordered up an offset rear shock bushing, and I'll post an update once I've tried that thing out on the Occam. If you do want to try a different rear shock or a stiffer spring, it's really hard to find a 550 or a 600 pound spring right now because supply chains are maxed out, and I can't just get a shock pump out and pump this up. I could do a whole video about why I don't love coil suspension. So yeah, those are a couple things I noticed. Because the bike is pretty short, it's really easy to play with. You can manual and go right into a stoppie really easily. And when it comes to bump jumps and stuff, this type of a shorter bike, it's pretty forgiving and pretty easy to pop around, and it's super fun. The other bike that I think most closely feels like the Occam would be the Ibis Ripley AF. The Ripley AF is a little bit shorter travel, and it does have the edge when trails are a little bit more man-made and almost kind of bike parky. And that's because the Ripley AF is longer, slacker, and more torsionally stiff. However, the Occam is a great bike when things are rough and tight. The Occam does get a bit more traction as it has more suspension travel, and I think that split pivot design is a little more active than the DW Link. Neither bike pedals bad, they both pedal very well, but each one does indeed have a spot where it might outshine the other slightly. That said, both bikes are phenomenal, and you can't go wrong with either. I was doing a tutorial for my Patreon page on how much to lean the bike in corners. I went ahead and grabbed the Occam for this because I thought it would be great to actually practice some of the cornering drills on this bike. This would help me get more familiar with the bike, and because it is a little different than my regular slew of bikes, it might help me get my skills improved at riding this sort of a machine. With more weight on the front wheel than many of my other bikes, I need to get more over the back of the bike for the really sharp corners. However, on the more medium and more open turns, I can use more of that middle of the bike, new school approach, and right there, it leans pretty well. Ah yes, uphill, climbing, whatever you want to call it. I feel like the Occam climbs just fine, but to be totally fair, I'm not a huge snob when it comes to how good a bike is at climbing. With how active that rear end is, I was able to get plenty of traction in even the most slippery of conditions. Does the bike bob? No, not really. And the whole thing's relatively light, so it's not that hard to lug it up the hill. With that shorter position and the steeper seat tube, geometry is totally fine for longer climbs. As traction becomes less and less available, that coil shock and that supple rear end both come in handy. The 36 grip 2 fork with 150 travel is great. I have no complaints with current generation Fox forks. They are incredible. You'll notice how much I manipulate the bike through the turns. Yes, I'm leaning, but I also push down and pump the bike quite a bit. The Occam responds to this technique really well. If you're going to be super aggressive in riding faster, even more bike parky trails than this, you might want to go for an air shock so you can add more volume reducers and ramp it up a little bit more. Ah yes, the Red Rocks of Sedona. Yes, this video encompasses 2 desert trips with the Orbea Occam. A few of you did ask me how the Occam would perform in Sedona, so I'm glad to report back with a little bit of first-hand experience. Well, the geometry is actually pretty good. Sedona riding is deceptively flat. I know we just show the brief sections of downhill in the videos here, but when you're actually riding there, it's kind of mind-blowing how flat the trails really are. As a result, a bike like the Occam does great. The one downside to the Occam is that when you push it really hard, it definitely starts to wind up, and you notice that it's a little bit on the softer side in terms of torsional stiffness. Is that a big deal? Well, if you're jumping and hucking quite a bit, you might notice that.
Oh. Bike's not quite as confidence-inspiring as the bigger ones for that.
I rode all 3 of the double black diamond trails in Sedona, the 3 H's. A bigger bike would be more confidence-inspiring. I still had a pretty darn good time riding the Occam and all that stuff.
The Hangover. The Hangover. I guess it's not really a movie. It's a trail. There's a little drop-off right here. Oh, hang a left. Fun.
Thus far, I've ridden 4 shocks on the general Occam platform. So on the 2020 version, there is a DPX2, which I put a big volume reducer in and then really got along well with. This Occam right here has an updated linkage design, which adds a little bit more progression to the end of the stroke.
Nice.
I had a Foxflow X2 air shock on hand, and sure enough, it's the same size, eye to eye, and same stroke as what the Occam LT comes with stock. I threw it on the bike along with a Motion Instruments data acquisition device and tried to measure the differences between the coil shock and the air shock. Well, the differences weren't very all that noticeable. Even riding the bike, the difference was very subtle. I was hoping it'd be different, but the X2 is designed to be a high air volume so that it feels more like a coil. My seat of the pants impression was that the X2 was pretty darn similar to the DHX2 coil shock, and at the end of the day, the little DPX2 is still my favorite shock as it can be made more progressive than either of those other offerings. The original Occam in its stock configuration was one of those bikes where I could bottom it out on aggressive jump takeoffs as well as on many of those landings. Woo. With the reduction in volume, it got more progressive, and I was then able to pump and pop and land, all with good success. SB130 is another bike we can compare to the Occam. The feel of the two is quite different, so I have the SB130 Lunch Ride Edition, and that's what I'm going to use here as my baseline. The Yeti is noticeably slacker and longer. As a result, the Yeti feels better at the higher speed stuff. The torsional stiffness of the Yeti is also not super high. However, it does have a more progressive feel to the actual ride characteristic of the frame as compared to the Occam. So even though they're both on the softer side of the spectrum, the Yeti is easier to push hard. All around, the more you push the Yeti, the more you get out of it. Whereas on the Occam, you can end up getting kind of to the limit of what the bike has to offer. Now, is that going to matter for most people? Probably not. But it's worth mentioning here. I like them both, and I think they're both good all-arounders. For the really tighter, slower stuff, you know, the suspension on the Occam, it is a little bit plusher, and you get a little more traction. And it's easier to handle through some of that. But the SB130, it covers a wide range of the riding spectrum. I like that bike a lot. Another bike you guys are going to ask about is the Ibis Ripmo. I have both the V2 and the AF versions, and they are completely different than the Occam. Even though the Occam on paper has more travel than the Ripmo rides like a much bigger bike, and it allows you to monster truck over stuff a little bit more.
Yeah, you good?
The Occam really does not go with the monster truck setting. You gotta manipulate the bike around obstacles rather than just always plow right through them. For all of you that are completely curious about who Orbea is and where they came from, I did a whole video going over the brand's super unique history, and I'll also link to that in a YouTube card to your top right, as well as in the description below. In short, Orbea is now a co-op, but they began making firearms in the Basque region of Spain a long time ago. Yeah, it's a pretty cool history for a bike company. Since my first experience with an Orbea bike just 2 years ago, I've had a lot of interactions with many of you who've ended up purchasing these bikes, and you've been pretty darn happy with them. It seems to me that the general ownership experience with the Orbea bikes is pretty darn positive. I want to give a big thanks to Jensen USA for supporting me with this Orbea Occam. Now, this is indeed a loaner bike, and I will have to send it back at some point here, but I've really enjoyed my time on it. Furthermore, thanks to all of you for your feedback on these bikes. Many of you seem to really like them quite a bit, so I'm glad I get to spend time enjoying a bike that's also enjoyed by many of you. If you want to learn more about the Orbea Occam and all the various different spec levels, I'm going to link to this Orbea Occam in the YouTube description below. But this is a great solid all-around trail bike, especially if your trails are not a local bike park, but they're more just normal. Anything you purchase from that link down below, that'll help support these videos. I also want to thank Logan, who captured all these amazing shots. Logan's a big part of how we make these videos happen. And thanks to all of you for watching and subscribing and leaving me your friendliest of comments down below. All right, with that, it's time for me to head out the door and actually ride a bike. Peace, everyone.